High above the coastal landscape of occupied France, on the crystal-clear morning of April 8, 1943, a collision of philosophies was about to take place at 27,000 feet. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermakin, a seasoned ace of Jagdgeschwader 26, peered through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 198-25, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the strange silhouettes climbing laboriously from the west. To the German veterans, who had spent years fighting the elegant, elliptical-winged Spitfires and the agile Soviet Yaks, the approaching American formation looked less like aircraft and more like industrial refuse thrown into the sky. They were massive, barrel-chested machines, shaped like teardrops, blunted at the front, their fuselages seemingly too heavy for their wings, their profiles ungainly and swollen. Hermakin, confident in the nimble superiority of his machine, keyed his radio, his voice thick with derision as he broadcast a sentiment that would ripple through the Luftwaffe ranks for months. He called them flying milk bottles, a moniker born of their vague, rounded resemblance to the glass dairy containers of the era, but the insult carried a deeper dismissal. These were not weapons of war, but corpulent intruders in a sky owned by predators. The pilots inside those American machines, the P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group, were straining against physics and fear. Their aircraft, weighing over 7 tons fully loaded, were beasts that defied the conventional wisdom of aeronautical engineering, which favored lightness and maneuverability. The 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R280 double wasp engines, massive 18-cylinder radials that generated heat and noise on a scale previously unknown in fighter aviation, were screaming to haul the massive airframes into the thin air. To the German wolves circling above, the Americans appeared to be sitting ducks, lumbering upward with the grace of bricks. What Hermakin and his comrades could not see, and what they would not understand until it was far too late, was that they were not looking at a tactical failure, but an industrial prophecy. They were witnessing the arrival of a weapon designed not for the dance of a dogfight, but for the brutal mathematics of annihilation. The laughter that echoed in the German cockpits that morning was the sound of a dying era, the last gasp of the romantic notion of nightly air combat before it was crushed by the sheer weight of American production and the terrifying efficiency of 8 synchronized .50 caliber machine guns. The genesis of this flying milk bottle lay in a moment of panic 3 years prior, in June 1940, when the fall of France sent shockwaves through the U.S. Army Air Corps. The specifications issued to Republic Aviation were born of desperation. They needed an interceptor that could fly higher and faster than the Luftwaffe's best. Alexander Kartveli, Republic's Georgian-born chief designer, looked at the requirements and realized that a conventional fighter could not meet them. He needed a supercharger system capable of compressing the thin air of the stratosphere, a system so large and complex it would dictate the shape of the entire aircraft. He essentially designed a fuselage around a massive turbo-supercharger and a spectral engine, creating a machine that was, by his own admission, a dinosaur. But as he told his team, it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. The resulting XP-47B was a shock to the senses. At nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it dwarfed the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt. It was 65% heavier than its predecessor. Pilots walking out to the tarmac were often struck by the sheer scale of the thing, asking with genuine skepticism if such a behemoth could actually leave the ground. The secret to its flight lay in the ducting system that gave the fuselage its deep, pregnant belly. Exhaust gases were piped from the engine at the nose, all the way to the rear of the plane to spin the turbine, which then rammed compressed air back up to the engine. It was a plumbing nightmare that added immense volume to the plane, but it allowed the R2800 engine to breathe at 30,000 feet, as easily as it did at sea level. However, the early days were written in blood. The 56th Fighter Group, under the command of the charismatic and demanding Major Hubert Hubbs, suffered horrific losses simply trying to learn how to fly the beast. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. The P-47 killed more Americans in New England skies than the Germans would in the first months of European combat. It was unforgiving. It ground-looped on landing, if the pilot wasn't vigilant. And in a dive, its weight caused it to accelerate so rapidly that it hit compressibility. Shock waves forming on the wings that froze the controls, locking the pilot in a death plunge. Yet those who survived the crucible of training, like Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a tenacious farm boy from Oklahoma, began to realize that the P-47 was not a plane you flew so much as a force of nature you directed. Johnson described the sensation as strapping oneself to a locomotive. The power was intoxicating, a raw, vibrating energy that promised invincibility if one could only harness it. But when combat began in the spring of 1943, the German assessment seemed correct. The P-47 could not turn with the Focke-Wulf 190, nor could it outclimb the Messerschmitt Bf 109. At medium altitudes, the German fighters danced around the heavy Americans, slashing at them from angles the P-47s couldn't match. The Luftwaffe pilots, quick to adapt, dragged the fights into turning engagements where the Thunderbolt's weight was a fatal liability. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, the ace commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, reported that the new American fighter was meat for the slaughter, a truck trying to race sports cars. The early statistics were grim. 14 Thunderbolts lost for only 3 confirmed German kills. The British RAF, watching from their bases, politely suggested the Americans might want to switch to joking that the best evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was for the pilot to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. But beneath the surface of these early defeats, a terrifying resilience was revealing itself. The P-47s were coming home with damage that was theoretically fatal. On May 4th, one aircraft returned with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, a level of punishment that would have disintegrated a delicate Messerschmitt or a fabric-covered Spitfire. The massive radial engine, air-cooled and lacking the fragile liquid radiators of the P-51 or Spitfire, could take cylinder hits and keep churning. The pilot was encased in a bathtub of armor plate, and the sheer structural bulk of the airframe absorbed explosive shells like a sponge. The turning point in perception, the moment the laughter began to curdle into disbelief, occurred on June 26, 1943, involving Robert S. Johnson. Returning from an escort mission, Johnson's formation was bounced by Focke-Wulf's from JG-26. In the ensuing chaos, Johnson's P-47 was raked by cannon fire. 20mm shells shattered his canopy, sprayed hydraulic fluid into his eyes, and severed his control cables. Fire erupted in the cockpit, trapped in a burning, crippled aircraft at 27,000 feet. With a canopy welded shut by shell impact, Johnson should have been dead. He managed to extinguish the flames and level the aircraft, heading for the English Channel. It was then that a lone Focke-Wulf 190 spotted the wounded giant. What followed was a surreal execution that failed. The German pilot pulled in behind Johnson and unleashed his cannons. The Thunderbolt shook violently as high explosive shells detonated against its armor and skin, but it did not fall. The German, likely confused, repositioned and fired again until his cannons clicked empty. He then switched to his machine guns, pouring hundreds of rounds into the fuselage, the wings, the tail. Johnson, huddled behind his armor plate, could do nothing but pray. The German pilot pulled alongside the flying wreck, his face visible, shifting from predatory focus to bewilderment. He shook his head, fired the last of his rounds, and saluted a gesture of respect for a ghost that refused to die before peeling away. When Johnson landed, his crew chief stopped counting at 200 holes. The structural backbone of the fuselage had been shot through, yet the jug had brought him home. This survivability changed the calculus of the pilots. If the plane could take anything, they could risk everything. Under the leadership of Hub Zemke, the Americans stopped trying to dogfight and began to fight on their own terms. They developed the Zemke fan and tactics that exploited the P-47's defining characteristic: gravity. Heavy objects fall fast, and the P-47 fell faster than anything else in the sky. From 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt pilot could roll over and dive, reaching 550 miles per hour, breaking the sound barrier in a controlled plummet. The lighter German fighters, if they tried to follow, would often tear their wings off or suffer control reversal. This gave birth to boom and zoom. The Americans would lurk high above, in the thin air where their turbos gave them superior power, and dive on the Germans like falcons. They would slash through the enemy formation, fire a devastating burst, and use the immense kinetic energy of their dive to zoom back up to altitude, untouched. It was physics weaponized. The instrument of this destruction was the battery of 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. While the Germans favored 20mm and 30mm cannons, which fired explosive shells but carried limited ammunition, often only 60 rounds per gun, the Americans chose volume. Each P-47 carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition. The guns were set to converge at a specific distance, usually 300 to 400 yards. When a pilot pulled the trigger, he was unleashing a dense cone of lead, a buzzsaw that chewed through metal and flesh with horrifying efficiency. The ballistic synergy of 8 guns firing simultaneously created a vibration so intense it felt like the plane was breaking apart. But the effect on the target was absolute. During the August 17, 1943, raid on Schweinfurt, Major David Schilling led a flight of Thunderbolts against a group of Messerschmitt Bf-110 destroyers. These twin-engine German heavy fighters were lined up to attack the bombers. Schilling's flight dropped from the heavens, their speed blurring their outlines. A German gunner, Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, watched the attack and later described the P-47s as hammers from heaven. When the American guns opened up, the Bf-110 in front of him didn't just catch fire, it disintegrated. The convergence of armor-piercing incendiary rounds sawed the wing off, shredded the cockpit, and turned the fuselage into a cloud of aluminum confetti. In less than 60 seconds, 8 German heavy fighters were erased from the sky. The sheer volume of fire meant that American pilots didn't need the sniper-like precision required of German cannon pilots. They simply had to put the enemy in the zone and hold the trigger. The .50 caliber rounds, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, possessed a kinetic energy that smashed engine blocks and severed wing spars. The incendiary compounds ignited fuel tanks instantly. The P-47 was a flying shotgun, and the sky was becoming a barrel dot. As 1943 turned to 1944, the technical war escalated. The Germans, struggling with the high-altitude performance of their fighters, found that above 25,000 feet, their engines gasped for oxygen. The BMW 801 engine, in the FW 190, and the Daimler-Benz in the BF 109 relied on mechanical superchargers that lost efficiency in the thin air. The P-47's turbo-supercharger, however, kept the manifold pressure high. This discrepancy proved fatal for Hans Philipp, a Luftwaffe legend with 206 victories. On October 8, 1943, he was caught at 28,000 feet. His engine was sluggish, his controls mushy. The P-47s that bounced him were operating at peak efficiency. Robert Johnson, now a lethal veteran, fired a burst that turned the Ace's aircraft into a fireball. The death of Philipp sent a chill through the Luftwaffe high command. If their best could not survive the fat American fighters at altitude, the war in the air was shifting irrevocably. Then came the paddle blades. In early 1944, the P-47D-22 arrived with a new propeller design. The blades were massive, 13 feet in diameter with a broad cord that grabbed the air like shovel scoops. This simple change revolutionized the aircraft's performance. The climb rate jumped from a mediocre 2,200 feet per minute to over 3,000, allowing the Thunderbolt to climb with the Germans. It also changed the acoustic signature of the war. The tips of these massive blades broke the sound barrier even at idle, creating a deep, resonant roar that could be heard for miles. The Germans called it Donnerschlag. It was a sound that announced impending violence. When combined with water methanol injection, which allowed pilots to redline the engines for emergency power, the P-47 became a monster that could chase down almost anything. German pilots who thought they had a safe margin of distance found the gap, closing with terrifying speed. By the spring of 1944, with the P-51 Mustang taking over the long-range escort duties, the Thunderbolt was unleashed on a new mission: ground attack. The invasion of Europe was imminent, and the Allies needed to sterilize the battlefield. The P-47, with its rugged radial engine and massive payload capability, was the perfect tool. It could carry two 1,000-pound bombs and a 500-pound bomb, a load equal to that of a medium bomber. Added to this were the high-velocity aircraft, rockets HVARs, Holy Moses rockets that packed the punch of a 105mm artillery shell. The transition turned the P-47 into the Jabo jagged bomber, the ultimate terror of the Wehrmacht. On the roads of France, anything that moved in daylight died. The German soldiers learned to fear the distinct howl of the radial engine. A column of trucks could be reduced to burning scrap in a single pass. The pilots, flying so low they could see the faces of the men they were killing, became masters of a brutal, close-range war. On June 6, 1944, the sky over Normandy was a solid roof of Thunderbolts. Over 500 of them patrolled the beaches, creating an air umbrella so dense that the Luftwaffe barely made an appearance. The few German pilots who tried to break through described a wall of aluminum. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer attempted to reach the landing zones with his unit and found himself trapped. He couldn't climb over the P-47s, he couldn't dive under them, and he couldn't fight them. His unit was shredded. The psychological impact on the German army was total. They coined a grim joke: if the plane is silver, it's American. If it's dark, it's British. If it's invisible, it's ours. The Jabo fever paralyzed German logistics. Trains were hunted down individually. Bridges were dropped. Tanks were cracked open by rocket fire. The P-47 was no longer just a fighter. It was an instrument of siege warfare, starving the German army of fuel, ammo, and movement. The industrial backdrop to this slaughter was the true decisive factor. In the U.S., factories like the one in Evansville, Indiana, were churning out P-47s like automobiles. At peak production, a new Thunderbolt rolled off the line every hour. The U.S. built over 15,600 of them. The sheer quantity of material allowed for a war of attrition that Germany could not comprehend, let alone match. When the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day 1945, a desperate mass attack on Allied airfields, they destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground. It was a tactical success that proved to be a strategic suicide. At the 365th Fighter Group's base, Major George Brooking looked at his burning Thunderbolts and told a captured German pilot, "We'll have new planes tomorrow. When will you get new pilots?" He was right. Within 48 hours, fresh P-47s arrived. The Germans, however, had lost their last cadre of instructors and aces. They had spent their inheritance of skill. While the Americans were just opening their account of endless production, the P-47 proved its versatility even against the dawn of the jet age. When the Messerschmitt Me-262 jets appeared, with speeds that should have made them untouchable, Thunderbolt pilots adapted. They caught the jets during takeoff and landing, or used their immense diving speed to intercept them. Major George Bostwick shot down 2 jets, noting that for all their speed, the Me-262s were fragile. One burst from the P-47's Roosevelt's organ, the nickname for the 8-gun battery, and the jets disintegrated. It was the ultimate vindication of the heavy philosophy. Speed mattered, but durability and firepower finished the fight. The P-47M, a sprint variant developed late in the war, could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight, chasing the jets on their own terms. By May 1945, the skies over Germany were silent, save for the roar of Allied engines. The Luftwaffe had been ground into the mud. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane that had been mocked as a milk bottle, a pregnant cow, and a dinosaur, stood as the victor. It had destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. It had broken the back of the German rail system and decimated its armored columns. But beyond the statistics lay the human story of a machine that brought its pilots home. Men like Gabi Gabreski, the top ace in Europe, swore by the Jug not just because it killed, but because it survived. The interrogation files of captured German pilots told the final chapter of the story. The assessments had shifted from minimal threat in 1943 to unsurvivable in 1945. Years later, at a reunion, Adolf Galland, the general of the German fighter arm, reflected on the mistake they had made. He admitted that they had looked at the P-47 and seen a caricature of a fighter, failing to recognize that it was the perfect embodiment of modern war. It was not a dueling sword. It was a sledgehammer. The Americans had understood that in a total war, the weapon that could absorb punishment, deliver overwhelming fire, and be produced in unlimited numbers would inevitably win. The laughter of April 1943 had been replaced by the silence of the grave. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had erased it, burying the prowess of the German aces under an avalanche of lead and industrial might, proving once and for all that in the brutal arithmetic of global conflict, quantity has a quality all its own.